Welcome to another edition of Revive and Thrive. This is episode number 19, and I'm your host, Joshua Blum. And today's episode is brought to you by the letter S. S stands for story. And so today we're going to be talking about what sort of things do you want to know for you and your children about how you kind of talk about your own story. So in the background, you might be able to hear some clattering. Hopefully it won't be too loud. I'm taking apart a car and I'm putting it back together. So I'm reassembling a battery, a hybrid battery. And I'm putting some of the bolts back in the battery. So this is one of those things that can kind of do two things at the same time. And since I have sort of a limited amount of time, I just happened to have today off and wanted to try to do a couple things. So just bear with me. There might be a few ratchet sounds and things like that here and there. Hopefully it won't be too bad for the audio. Yeah, so S stands for story. If you're new to us, by the way, you're wondering what all that was. I am a child psychiatrist, and for the past couple of months, we've been doing this podcast focused on physician burnout, specifically for fathers. And each episode is a different topic. And so the whole idea is that you walk away with maybe a couple actionable steps that you might be able to take in your own life. Because sometimes when we talk about these things, that's all that happens. We just sort of talk about them. Thoughts and prayers only get you so far. And at some point, you have to make use of that information in some way in your life. I think what hospital administrations often are concerned about this, and they have been for a number of years, but I don't know if they necessarily have a clear sense of what to do, because a lot of times the issues are systemic and they can't be so easily fixed from within. But I will say that within each person, though, I think that's a different story, because everybody's situation is a little bit different. And so a one-size-fits-all, take our wellness class and that sort of thing, and you'll be better. It's good for optics. It's better than nothing. But I think it's going to vary depending on the person. I thought I would introduce this topic of today. It's a heavy topic, and that's something called intergenerational trauma. You're like, oh my God, we're going to talk about some of these heavy topics today. How we think about ourselves and how we do what we do has a lot to do with, I would say, our own story. It has a lot to do with our background. Intergenerational trauma is the idea that when something bad happens to one person, it doesn't just usually end with them. It carries on into the next generation and the next. So an example that sort of was widespread, let's look at the Great Depression that occurred in the 20s and 30s. And, certainly in the U.S., there was some carryover into other parts of the world, I do believe. But what happened there? So you had for a long period of time a lot of people who were out of work and had to make do with very little. And so those ideas got carried down in terms of things that people would, practices that people would do in ways of thinking. And so, for example, the idea that you might not have certain things, so you'd better save, it would get carried down to children, for example. If you look at things that are race-related things, what happens to parents may in fact be carried down to children because they're trying to teach their children and keep them safe in the world. And so they'll be like, watch out for X, Y, or Z because it didn't work out so well for me in my life. So we have a way of doing that. It's not necessarily something that we do consciously, but it may in fact be something that we do with our children. And because of the way we think and operate, they pick those things up. They're always watching. That's the thing about kids. They're always watching and they're always observing. And they understand more than we often give them credit for, which is very odd. I think that sometimes we'll try to protect them from things that they are more than aware of, although they may not necessarily always know how to express that. When we think about stuff that happens to us, in every family there's a role that people will play different family members will typically adopt certain roles, but they don't do it necessarily consciously. And so if you have a sense about the sort of role that you might have played in your own family, you already kind of know where this is going. But if you think about some common things that people do in families, you may have a caretaker. Now, you could say both parents are caretakers, but there may not be two parents, or there may be an absent parent or whatever, but you have a sort of a nurturer kind of role. You may have a sort of traditional provider kind of role, someone who provides financially or whatever, but is not there emotionally. You might have a peacemaker, someone who helps smooth over issues that exist in the family. You might have a clown, someone who kind of is their function is to sort of lighten the mood, so to speak. You might have someone who is the therapist. In other words, kind of like takes on the role of being the family human resource person, so to speak. And people go to them with their problems. They may end up keeping secrets and, being privy to family confidences and things like that. And then what ends up happening, the traditional parent-child role doesn't always, of course, happen. So if you think about what typically will happen in a family, I guess you could say ideal from at least a Western standpoint, is that children are there to be children. They do their thing and they grow and they learn and so forth. But then what happens? What happens if parents can't necessarily fulfill their parental duties in all ways, or in any ways, frankly? Let's just say someone is an alcoholic, for example. And so there may be stretches of time where they're fine, but there may be other parts of the time, other days or moments or whatever when they're not so fine. And they may rely on other family members to do what they can't do. Now, it might be all fine if the people who are doing that are adults. But what happens if they're children? So when children start to take on the role of caretaker, before they're ready, we have an idea called parentification, which was, I remember learning about this word way back when, and having never heard of it before. But it is exactly sort of like what it sounds. It's becoming a parent, but it sort of implies before you're actually ready. The odd thing about children is that because they are very resilient, they will adapt to pretty much anything. Probably even more so than adults. I mean, I think many people have a greater capacity for resilience than they actually know. But children in particular, like I said, they're watching the world around them and they just adjust. And so if they kind of recognize in some way that a parent is not well or not able to be a parent in all ways, they'll probably start to do it themselves. Now, they might end up parenting themselves, usually not terribly successfully, but a very common other scenario is that they might end up parenting younger children. Now, some of this is just sort of being a big sister or a big brother, because you may sort of act as an example. And in some families that's fostered, be a good example for your younger siblings. But in other cases, it happens unwittingly, in which case the older sibling, or whoever is kind of the most able to do this, doesn't have to be the oldest one, will kind of become a little mom or a dad, because actual mom and dad either is not there or is just not able to do that. And like most things in life, it's not free. Nothing's really free. So when that happens, in many cases that'll happen, say, like in childhood, often that means that person's childhood gets a little bit curtailed because of that. They don't get to do the typical kid stuff because they're busy doing mom or dad stuff. And in some ways that makes them feel very mature, and they may actually like that to some degree. But then they grow up and they kind of realize, I didn't really have a childhood. Or they feel that they missed out on aspects of life, and that then leads to things like depression. Or one other thing, of course, that it may lead to issues with anxiety and so forth, because they're trying to deal with things that they're not really ready for. They don't really have the life experience or preparation for. And so it's stressful as a result because they're not prepared for it. And of course, then that leads to problems later on. And just based on the way the brain typically develops, That'll often lead to issues with attention and so forth later. The idea is that when those things happen, and those things have happened all throughout human history, we tell ourselves a certain story about why that happened. And it depends on how that story goes, determines what you end up doing with it. If it's a story where, hey, that's what needed to be done, and we did it, and it made us stronger, and it was something that it was viewed in a positive light, then we may end up carrying that forward and looking at that as a overall positive experience and something that we actually may want to replicate in other parts of our life. It's like, look, I did it all by myself, and other people can do it too. On the other hand, if it was something that was, maybe there was some positive parts of it, but it was also overall maybe a neutral or net negative experience, we'd be like, you know what? I don't think that's something my own children should be experiencing. I want them to be kids. So, we do this in medicine too. We think about if you're at all involved in residency training, maybe you're a program director, or perhaps you just are involved in teaching people. There's often a debate about how much of the past do we need to replicate. For example, before there were work hours restrictions or things like that, when people would fall asleep driving home and all those kinds of experiences. Hopefully that doesn't happen anymore. But on the other hand, is something lost because people are spending less hours learning and working. So we do the exact same thing. There's sort of this idea like, well, I did it, and so therefore you have to do it too, because that's a rite of passage. The story that we tell about ourselves, the tone at which we view it, determines a lot about how we kind of proceed forward, whether it is a sort of a positive one or a negative one, and so forth. So if you haven't thought about the story that you tend to tell yourself and how you tend to fit in with your family of your origin, that often will give you kind of a worldview about how you tend to operate in other arenas. Because that same story may be the blueprint that you carry forward as you go through your life. Now, a lot of this is not conscious. We just tend to do it because it's what we know. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the optimal thing to do. It doesn't even necessarily mean it's something we would want to do. It's just that we just do it because that's a default thing to do. Habitual does not necessarily mean ideal. When we talked about the episode on posture, that was P for all you linguists. We talked about this idea, but in a different context. So when our body adopts a particular posture, it may not, in fact, be a correct anatomical ideal posture. It may, in fact, be something else born out of our circumstances. And when your body gets used to that, that's what it goes to. It just does that, even if it's not ideal, and it causes problems further on down the line. And so this is the exact same thing. The way we operate in a default way does not necessarily mean it's the best way. And so when we think about the story that we want to tell our children and how, at some point children always often have a question about, learning about their grandparents and so forth. What's the story that you want to tell them? And it may be worthwhile just to think about how you want to explain certain things. Families can be messy. There's usually not all sunshine and roses. And so you may want to think about how you explain certain things that are difficult. There may have been things like wars, divorces, genocide, all kinds of trauma and bad stuff that can happen with people. But on the other hand, children know about those things. They're going to know about them, and they will figure them out. So it's often handy for them to hear about those things from their parents first in a way that is palatable for them at that particular age. So they don't feel either that stuff was hidden or taboo, because, like I said, they'll figure it out anyway. There's a quote I thought I would end with, and this is from a book by an author named Kevin Kelly. He's one of the editors, I believe, of Wired magazine, and he's written a number of different things. It's a little book of aphorisms called Excellent Advice for Living. It's on page 174, and he says, "You can't change your past, but you can change your story about it. What is important is not what happened to you, but what you did about what happened to you." And so I'm going to end with those words, but it's something to think about because, again, it gets to this idea that thinking and talking is usually not enough. It usually involves action and change, and it can start very, very small. it can start with the story that we tell ourselves, and that'll help us carry forward in other parts of our life. So thank you for listening. Have a great weekend. I'll talk to you next time.